Watching someone you love suffer from a severe mental illness is exhausting, but the hardest part is often when they flatly refuse the necessary medical care that they so obviously need. We tend to view this refusal through a behavioral lens. We assume they are being stubborn or acting non-compliant or simply in deep psychological denial. That assumption is baked directly into our healthcare and legal systems. To get help from community support programs, a person usually has to voluntarily agree to participate. Even diversion programs like mental health courts have this exact requirement. A person has to commit a crime to trigger the process, and then they have to voluntarily opt in to the treatment plan. Building a safety net entirely around voluntary compliance leaves those who are incapable of asking for help without a viable path to care. For 30 to 50% of people living with severe mental illnesses, like schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, refusing treatment is not a choice at all. They are experiencing a specific medical symptom called anosognosia. It is a neurological condition where the brain is physically incapable of perceiving its own illness. This diagram illustrates how the brain processes damage. On the left, a healthy brain immediately recognizes a broken arm and sends pain signals. On the right, a brain with anosognosia is completely blind to its own neurochemical imbalance. Much like a stroke patient unable to recognize their paralysis, they literally do not know they are sick. Because this insight pathway is physically blocked, they cannot process external information and will not believe a doctor who says they need medication. Demanding voluntary compliance from someone experiencing anosognosia creates a biological paradox, which requires a structure of care that does not rely on self-reporting. When we leave anosognosia untreated, the decline is grim and predictable. An individual stops taking their prescribed medication, they often lose their housing, and they begin a cycle of showing up in emergency rooms. Eventually, they reach the end of that spiral, ending up under a temporary involuntary hold in a hospital psychiatric ward or sitting in a local jail cell for a minor offense. This chart compares the financial toll. Reactive crisis cycling in emergency rooms and jails costs $60,000 per person per year. Coordinated community care costs $12,000. Waiting for a crisis to escalate drains public funds at a 5-times multiplier. Using a jail cell as a default mental health clinic wastes community resources, and more importantly, it abandons the patient when they are at their most vulnerable. So, how do we treat a patient whose illness physically prevents them from accepting help? We have to build a structural bridge. That bridge is a legal mechanism called Assisted Outpatient Treatment, or AOT. It is a civil court process that intervenes early, well before a crime occurs, meaning the patient never receives a criminal record. Under an AOT order, a judge connects the statutory authority of the court directly to local healthcare providers, mandating that a specific treatment plan be carried out in the community. The court requires high-intensity wraparound services. The patient gets medication management, housing assistance, therapy, and peer support, all while remaining in their own home. If the patient skips a dose or misses an appointment, the system is notified immediately. This allows the clinical team to step in and adjust the care plan right away, rather than waiting weeks for a behavioral explosion. The court order acts as an external guardrail. When the patient's brain cannot generate its own insight or accountability, the AOT framework provides it for them. When a patient is sustained on an AOT order for 180 days or more, the clinical outcomes become remarkably clear. At 6 months, psychiatric hospitalizations drop by 50 to 60%, followed by steep reductions in homelessness and arrests. Brief hospital stays during this time are just necessary medical adjustments to ensure continuity of care, finally breaking the revolving door cycle of crisis. Over those 6 months, the physical fog of anosognosia begins to lift. The brain heals enough to recognize its own condition, allowing the clinical team to transition from a court order into a lasting, voluntary relationship. This period of stability provides the foundation for broader recovery, as clinicians and families report that once symptoms are managed, individuals often begin repairing relationships and finding their way back to employment or education. There is an understandable tension here. Mandating medical care is often criticized as a restriction of civil rights and personal liberty. If a disease physically prevents someone from perceiving their own illness, total non-intervention results in a quiet form of abandonment. It leaves a vulnerable person to navigate a deteriorating condition without the capacity to recognize it. AOT functions as a temporary bridge that prioritizes stability. By addressing the biological lack of insight, the system helps a person regain the dignity required to lead an autonomous life.